Hello, Robert James Fischer is the 11th world champion, and his openings. This is my subject today. I will record a few videos, and this is the first part of it. Fischer was very strong in the openings. He brought the openings to an entirely new level. Preparation, analysis, gathering and working with information, everything connected to the openings was brought to a new professional level. Fischer was also very principled in the openings. He was true to his openings, and usually he played the same openings through his entire chess career, although later, especially in his matches and especially in his match against Spassky from 1972, so the World Championship match, he became more flexible and more universal. So let's see what Fischer liked to play. With the white pieces he almost exclusively played e2, e4. He actually never played in a serious game d2, d4, and he even wrote in his book that he doesn't play it on principle. So after e4, let's start with the most classical answer, e5. Fischer was a great expert of the Ruy Lopez, so knight f3 followed by bishop b5 after knight c6. But I should say that Fischer, as we know, Fischer was a chess fanatic. He always worked on chess and he loved this game. One of his passions was to analyze the old classic games, and this also had some influence on his openings. For instance, from the old games he learned to play some gambits, and from time to time he also played, after e4, e5, he plays king's gambit, or he used to play also knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and for instance after bishop c5 he played some very nice games with b2, b4, so the Evans gambit. But generally his beloved move was bishop b5. So let's see some examples to see how Fischer handled Ruy Lopez. I will start with the game Fischer-Unziker from 1959. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. So the main line of Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. Castle, bishop e7, ot1, b5. I don't stop at these moves because they were played thousands of times. Bishop e3, e6, c3, castle short, h3, knight a5. This is a Chigorian variation. Knight a5 followed by c5, d4, queen c7, knight bd2, bishop d7, knight f1, rook e8, knight e3, g6. So we come to this position, and in this game Fischer took on e5. He also played bishop d2, but generally he liked to play this structure, which is a typical structure for Chigorian variation of the Ruy Lopez. White tries to exploit square d5, but black has generally sufficient resources to protect it. Fischer was a very good specialist of playing such positions with this pawn structure, and this is one example of it. So here Fischer played knight h2, rook d8. We see that white slowly brings his pieces closer to the king side. Bishop e6, knight hg4. This is an important move in white strategy. After knight hg4, h6, g4. This is quite typical for the Ruy Lopez. White opens the h file, and very important, he also exchanged this knight from f6, which controlled square d5. So after taking, black played queen c6, and this position was also played before, also actually by Fischer, the same year. But generally it was played before, and white used to play here queen g3, f6, but after g5, if black takes on g5, queen takes e5, queen d6, black doesn't have problems. The position is very close to equal. So Fischer invented a novelty, the move g4, g5, which he played in this game, and he actually played this move the same year, few months earlier, against Shokan. He played also g5. We see that the idea, so for the moment, white simply sacrifices this pawn on g5, but the general idea is to isolate this pawn on e5. So if black would in the future play f6, white would take, and the pawn on e5 will remain weak. The idea behind g5 is that if black takes on g5, no one of his opponents took on g5, white wants to play knight d5, so attacking also the bishop from g5. So for instance, after bishop e7, white takes on bishop g5, so this doesn't work for black, so black should take on c1 here, bishop takes c1, but then white gives first check, the king should go to h8, because after king g7, white takes on e8 with check, and rook a takes c1, so this is a position which Fischer considered that white has good compensation for the pawn. Many years later in analysis it was shown that with precise play black should be able to keep equality in this position. But of course this doesn't change anything. His opponents were afraid to take on g5 here, and even in that position white still has many ideas to play. So after g5, Unziker and Shokan, they both played knight c4, which is very logical to exchange this knight, but then the knight goes to another side. So this is another idea of g5, it frees square g4 for the knight, bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, and Shokan earlier that same year played knight b6 against Fischer, and he lost. But knight b6 is probably the best move. Unziker tried f6 in the game which I want to show you, or a fragment of the game. And now we see the main idea. White takes on f6, bishop takes f6, and a4. This is sort of position white was aiming for when he played g5, and in fact a closer look reveals that white has a solid positional advantage here, because first of all he has a bishop pair, and secondly he has a better pawn structure due to this pawn on e5, and also the king side is now weakened. So basically black has 3 pawn islands, white has only 2. So white is better strategically, and after knight b6, a takes b5, a takes b5, bishop e3, white is simply better strategically, and Fischer won this game. It was a long game, but it was quite a clear win by white. So this ability to use some small advantages, which in the end will result in some clear positional advantage, was very good by Fischer, and he used it in many games, and especially the Ruy Lopez was a good opening to show this ability, because the position is very strategical. Strategical factors come in foreground. Our next example is the game against Keres. So in this position, Keres, instead of queen c7, which is a main move, Keres made the move knight d7. This is a variation which was developed by Keres, and it's called the Keres variation, but in this game he introduced this move. So in 1962, Fischer Keres. The idea is that black brings the knight to b6, and Fischer and Keres was very proud of his idea. He played many games with this variation later on. But Fischer, when he first met this move, he was not very impressed by it. He thought that, okay, the knight comes to b6, but first of all it's not clear whether the knight is really better placed on b6 than on f6, because on f6 it's it protects also the king side and the king, and black wastes time. So his reaction was d takes e5, which is the main move, d takes e5, and again we see the same pawn structure. So he continues now his plan to bring the knight to e3, knight e3, rook d8. Now, of course, this plan with bishop e6, with knight h2 g4 is no longer that impressive for white, because the knight is not on f6, so white will not exchange this knight. But Fischer here made a very strong move, knight d5, which was underestimated by Keres. And this is again shows very deep understanding of the position by Fischer, because after the exchange of these pawns, e4 against e5, white will get these bishops looking to black's king, and also if we look, black's knights, they are far away from the king. So for instance, this is a pawn sacrifice actually. Black can, for instance, take with the bishop on d5, which didn't happen in the game. Take, and now protect the pawn e5 with the move f6. Now the pawn on d5 will be lost, but we see that white now has this open diagonal, and after h4, knight takes d5, h5, which was Fischer's intention, white will continue with queen e4, and we see that black's king lacks defenders. So white will continue to provoke weaknesses in black's pawn structure. He has here very good compensation for the pawn. So we see that Keres played simpler. He took on d5 twice, but after knight takes e5, it is actually not so simple for black to defend this position, and it's objectively better for white, because the knight still remains on a5, and white already threatens here to take on f7. There are many moves for black here, but everywhere white keeps the initiative. In the game, black played rook a7, bishop f4, queen b6, and rook a d1, bringing the last piece into play. For instance, if black here takes on a2, then white has different ideas connected with b2, b4, and then bishop takes h7, the bishop on a2 will be hanging. For instance, even here white can already take on d8, queen takes d8, and b4, so followed by such ideas with bishop takes h7, rook d1. The position remains quite complicated, but white is better coordinated. We see that all these pieces, they are on the edge of the board, so all these variations, they work well for white. In the game, Keres played g6, but after knight g4, white already starts to exploit these weaknesses in black's kingside pawn structure, and white won this game in 41 moves. This position is with clear advantage for white. Thanks to his, you see that his pieces are better centralized, and also they are closer to the kingside, where is the main battlefield. Fischer's love for old classic games, as I said, had also influence on his choice, not only of the openings but also on the variations. In our next example, Fischer-Korchnoi from the Interzonal Tournament 1962. Fischer played suddenly in this position instead of the usual move h3, which is by far the main move he had. He played the old move d4, and of course he surprised very much his opponent, because the move d4 was popular in the first part of 20th century, but it basically disappeared from practice later on, because black found quite clear ways to neutralize white's pressure in the center. And first of all, this was a game Capablanca-Bogolubov, where Bogolubov with black pieces achieved advantage against Capablanca. But Fischer analyzed this game and found a new idea, which he also implemented in the present game Fischer-Korchnoi. So after d4, black follows the main path, bishop g4, bishop e3. So the game Capablanca Bogolyubov from 1922. Take, take, knight a5. This was also played in the game. Bishop c2, knight c4. The alternative is c5, bishop c1, c5, b3, knight a5. These days it is considered that better for black is to play knight b6 due to the present game Fischer-Korchnoi. So Capablanca in this position played bishop b2, and after knight c6, d5, knight b4, black, which was Bogolyubov, was better in this game because he exchanges a very important bishop on c2 and remains with a bishop pair. But Fischer spotted the move d5 here instead of bishop b2, and this is a strong novelty which changed the evaluation of this position. Now the knight remains badly placed on a5, and white wants to play h3. Actually, the game after d5, black played knight d7, knight bd2. It is important that after bishop f6, white has rook b1. So it looks like black has some activity, but in fact, white's majority in the center is more important than black's majority on the queen side. Korchnoi played c4. He wants to use his pawn majority. And after h3, black has a very difficult choice what to do. After bishop h5, white wanted to play g4, bishop g6, and knight f1. The knight goes to g3. The bishop is isolated on g6. Later on, white can consider to advance the f-pawn. He has more pieces on the king side, and it is not clear how can black create counterplay on the other side of the board. We can look that the knight is still on a5. It's not so simple for black here to create counterplay. In the game, instead of retreating the bishop, Korchnoi took on f3, take on f3, knight takes f3, took on b3, took on b3, but this position is already with a solid positional advantage for white. It is not big, but it is a quite clear advantage thanks to the bishop pair, thanks to the pawn majority, thanks to the knight on a5, which is out of play. And Fischer won this game in 44 moves, also quite clear game. And talking about Ruy Lopez, I should also say, of course, that Fischer reintroduced the exchange variation on the top level. Again, this is a clear influence of the old classic games. First of all, of Lasker, who played the exchange variation in Ruy Lopez. And in our next example, actually, Fischer showed that he can play exactly like the old masters. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop took on Fischer took on c6, d takes c6, castle short, f6. Of course, he also had some new ideas in these lines. So let's see which idea he introduced in this game. Knight c4, castle. And in this position, white took on d6 in some games also. White played here the move c3, but everywhere black is in principle okay. Now Fischer makes another move. He plays queen d3. He just wants to bring the rook on d1, and he's not, most important, he's not afraid of knight e5, which happened in the game. Take, take, and f4. So Fischer is ready to play a position with opposite colored bishops, but then white will just have sort of an extra pawn on the king side. We see that white has this pawn majority, 4 pawns versus 3, while black's pawns here are practically 3 versus 3. So after taking on c4, on d4, bishop takes d4, white, it is clear that only white plays for a win here, and black should play very passively here, only to fight for a draw, which is not a simple task at all, because white's bishop on d4 is also much more active, and white has ideas to play f5, e5. After bishop d6, Fischer played a very strong move, f5. We can see here a clear similarity to the game Lasker Capablanca, where white also played f5. This move looks not very good from the strategical point of view because black gets square e5, the pawn on e4 looks weak. But already in that game, Lasker Capablanca from St. Petersburg, it was shown that the move of 5 also has clear advantages. First of all, is to limit the activity of the bishop from c8. And white, so after, in this game, we can see that what happened. Queen e7, black makes some normal moves, but he will slowly end up in a more difficult position. White's main strategic idea is to play e5 to get rid of this weak pawn and to remain with 3 versus 2 on the king side and with a strong knight on e5. So Fischer did it very well. g4, black cannot use weaknesses created by such advances. Rook e7, knight f3, and e5. Take on e5, rook e4. So this all happened in the game. White will take on e5, and again he has a strategic advantage. So take, knight e5. Again, we see that Fischer ended up in a position with a clear strategic advantage. Of course, the position is not winning. Of course, black has many resources here, but white is already better. White has clear trumps in this position. He has clear advantages, 3 versus 2, strong knight on e5, and the idea is further to advance the kingside pawns and to combine different attacking ideas. Fischer won this game quite clearly. So we can see again that Fischer had, first of all, a very good understanding of such position. Secondly, he had a very good knowledge of old games, where he took different ideas from. And his good understanding of Ruy Lopez helped him a lot when he became the world champion, because the 10th game from the match Fischer-Spassky was Ruy Lopez in 1972, and this was one of the key games of this match, where Fischer nicely won this game, and by many specialists this game is considered Fischer's best achievement in this match. In the next video we will move on to Sicilian defense. Thank you.